They say a mother's love is boundless, but I had no idea mine would be used as a weapon against me until the day I was dragged, barefoot and bloodied, from the halls of the Shin estate like a criminal. The scent of roses and incense still clung to my hair from the naming ceremony we had held just hours before for my baby girl, Luna. She had barely turned a month old. Her cries were still fragile, her skin still untouched by the world's filth, but the man who called himself my husband Lucas Shun looked at me like I was filth incarnate. The room had been brimming with guests, chandeliers casting halos of light over their polished faces, and then Madeline Quinn arrived, draped in white like some tragic martyr, clutching a document and wearing eyes rimmed with practiced tears. "She sold me," Madeline whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear, pointing a trembling finger at me. "She forced me into prostitution. I was only 16. The silence that followed was suffocating. I remember the way the porcelain teacup slipped from my hand and shattered on the floor, the fragments catching light like little daggers. No one asked me to explain. Lucas stepped forward, not with confusion, not with hesitation, but with righteous fury. "Disgusting," he said, as if spitting venom. "Get her out of my sight." That was how it began, the undoing of everything I had sacrificed, every prayer whispered in temples. Every night I stayed awake, tending to his family, while ignoring the growing void in my own heart. I was loaded onto a truck under the cover of night, bound for a remote region of rolling hills and frost-laced rivers where the Shin family-owned horse ranches no outsider ever visited. The air there smelled like hay and sweat, and my presence was announced with whips and snarls. They stripped me of my clothes, then of my name. "You're nothing here," one of the handlers sneered as he pushed me into a pen like I was livestock. Days bled into nights. The line between sleep and pain blurred until I couldn't tell which bruises were fresh and which had healed. I was fed scraps, lived in a wooden shack that stank of manure and mold, and endured things no human soul should endure, all while clinging to one vision. Luna's tiny hand wrapped around my finger that last day, her breath warm against my chest, the soft hum of her cooing a lullaby I carried through the torment. For years. It took 4 years before Lucas came back into my life. He didn't even flinch when he saw what I'd become, bones jutting out beneath my torn skin, hair matted and dulled, eyes that no longer belonged to the woman he married. "She's still alive?" he asked the foreman, tone dripping with annoyance rather than surprise. "Bring her in. Madeline wants to see her." My blood turned to ice at the mention of her name. I was brought to a makeshift guest house on the estate, dressed in coarse rags, the marks of old lashes still angry on my back. Madeline lounged on a sofa, her red nails tapping the side of a porcelain teacup as if playing some symphony only she could hear. "Nina," she smiled, eyes scanning my broken frame like she was inspecting meat. "What a survivor. You're stronger than I expected. What do you want?" My voice was a whisper, but even I could hear the splinters of hatred in it. She stood, stepped closer, and cupped my chin like I was a pet. "I want you to understand," she said, tilting her head with mock innocence, "that Lucas did this all for me. That you were never more than a placeholder. That your suffering was the proof of his love for me." I looked at Lucas then, expecting even a flicker of guilt, but his face was stone, carved from cold loyalty to the woman who had destroyed my life. That was the moment something inside me cracked, not just a bone, not a tendon, but a deeper layer, one that tethered me to hope. "You'll never find peace," I told them. "Not in this life." I requested to see Luna. I begged, crawling on bleeding knees through the dirt outside their estate like a dog begging for scraps. Lucas didn't even respond. Madeline laughed. "She doesn't know who you are," she sneered. "And why would she? You're just a ghost haunting a past no one remembers." That night I returned to the pen, but I didn't pray like I used to. I didn't ask for deliverance. I asked for wrath. I asked the enlightened one not for forgiveness, but for fire. Days passed. Then came the day of the hunt. They were entertaining guests: Lucas, Madeline, her high society friends in tailored boots and feather hats. I was ordered to help prepare the grounds. That was when I saw her, Luna. She was walking beside Madeline, her tiny hands grasping a puppy leash, her laughter carried by the wind. I froze. My body trembled, and for a moment I thought I was hallucinating. "That's your daughter," A guard whispered behind me, tone sharp with mockery. Cute, isn't she? Then the dogs were released. One, a massive hound meant for tracking prey, broke from formation and charged toward Luna. The world slowed. I screamed, lunged forward, but the guards held me back. Lucas didn't move. Madeline didn't blink. By the time I reached her, her body was limp. Blood painted the grass like spilled wine. My screams echoed through the valley, but they only stared at me like I was mad. They buried her in a garden she never walked in. I wasn't allowed to attend. I wasn't even allowed to say goodbye. Days later, I was brought to a cold temple at the edge of the estate, forced to kneel while Madeline read aloud a statement claiming I had gone insane. "This is mercy," Lucas said. "You're being exiled to save what's left of your mind." That night, I crushed the relic I had hidden in my sleeve, the last artifact left from the temple I once served. It splintered into gold dust and fire, and I felt my soul peel away from my body like silk being torn from bone. In that moment, I wasn't Nina the wife or Nina the servant. I was vengeance incarnate. I rose with the scent of sandalwood clinging to my skin and the whisper of my daughter's last breath guiding my steps. Lucas screamed as light erupted around me, as the wrath of the divine ones poured through the air like a thunderclap splitting the sky. "You will suffer," I told them. "And when your suffering ends, your souls will wander alone." Then I vanished, leaving behind the shell they had broken, but taking with me every ounce of their sin. The storm that followed drowned the valley for 7 days. I watched from the mountainside, cloaked in mist and silence, as their world began to crack. And I knew this was only the beginning. The rain had long since stopped, but the valley still reeked of rot. Mud clung to the earth like old sins refusing to be washed away. I wandered the mountains in silence, unseen by men, untouched by time, no longer bound by hunger or pain. Yet despite the freedom, I felt no peace, only the dull ache of something severed too deep to heal. I watched from afar as Lucas returned to the manor with his hand in Madeline's, their smiles brittle, skin pallid like ghosts dressed in flesh. He had called my disappearance a divine punishment, whispered to his associates that I'd lost my mind under the weight of guilt, but I saw the truth hidden in his eyes. Fear. He slept with candles lit now, and guards posted at every corner of the estate, though no blade or bullet could protect him from what was already unraveling inside. I did not haunt him with footsteps or shadows. I haunted him with silence, with the absence of my screams, with the memory of what he had refused to feel. The servants whispered of his declining health, how food no longer pleased him, how he would flinch at the sound of wind chimes or the cry of a child. Madeline, ever the actress, played the role of the grieving stepmother with tragic elegance. She commissioned a marble statue of Luna in the gardens, a grotesque monument to a lie, while privately mocking the child she had helped destroy. I watched her smear crimson lipstick across her lips one morning, smiling in the mirror as she whispered, "Everything is mine now." But her hands trembled when she touched the child's clothes. I knew then that guilt had begun to rot her from within. Still, guilt alone was not enough. My purpose had never been to linger in shadows, not forever. When I returned, I did not come as Nina Grace the martyr, I came as consequence. I took human form once more, not through birth, but through divine will, reborn not as a child but as a woman with no past, no name, only eyes that had seen too much. I took up residence in a nearby town under an alias, working at a humble bookstore where no one asked questions. I moved quietly, like wind slipping through a crack in a door. There, I began my search, not for vengeance, but for fragments. Luna's soul had not yet passed on. I felt it in the stillness of night, in the pull beneath my ribs when I walked past temples or heard lullabies carried by the breeze. She was trapped, chained by the weight of unfinished karma, unable to leave the plane of suffering. I needed to find the relics of her spirit before the 7th cycle passed, or she would remain bound to sorrow forever. Meanwhile, Lucas was falling apart. He hid it well under designer suits and tight smiles, but the cracks had become too deep to conceal. The business was faltering, deals collapsed without reason, investors pulled out inexplicably, strange misfortunes dogged every transaction. He began seeing a spiritual consultant, a self-proclaimed clairvoyant who claimed my spirit was cursing him. He laughed it off in public, but I saw the desperation in the way he clutched prayer beads at night, knuckles white, lips moving silently beneath the covers. Madeline's glamour began to dull. She aged faster than time could explain, her eyes losing their spark, her laughter sounding too sharp. Once she dreamed of being his wife, but now she was chained to a man unraveling, haunted by the woman she thought she had erased. She tried to seduce him back into sanity, but every touch reminded him of what he had destroyed. "Do you still think of her?" she asked him one night as they sat beneath the glow of golden chandeliers. Lucas said nothing. That silence broke her more than any answer. I visited Luna's grave in secret. The statue they built had cracks now, ivy crawling up its legs, as if the earth itself sought to reclaim her. I knelt in the shadows, fingers brushing the soil, whispering to the spirit I could no longer hold. "I'll free you, little star," I murmured, "even if it breaks me again." A child's voice giggled beside me, soft as mist. I turned, heart clenching, but no one stood there. Only the wind, and the faint scent of lotus. I followed that scent across temples and ruins, through old scriptures and hidden rites, piecing together the ritual that would unbind her from the chains of suffering. I needed 5 pieces of her soul fragments hidden where she once lived, where she once smiled, where she once died. Each retrieval weakened me, for they were soaked in sorrow. The first was hidden in her music box, tucked in a locked drawer in Lucas's study. I broke in one stormy night, cloaked in lightning and wind, slipping past guards too tired to care. The box still played her lullaby. As I touched it, a vision flooded my mind, her giggling as I tucked her in, the soft weight of her on my chest. I collapsed in tears, the soul shard searing my palm with heat and grief. The second fragment lay buried beneath the swing set in the garden where she once played. I watched Madeline from the window as she sat on the porch, wine in hand, muttering to herself. "She never cried," she said. "Even when the dog bit her, she didn't cry." Her voice was shaking, distant, as if she were speaking through a dream. She just looked at me, like she knew. I realized then that Madeline was unraveling too, not from fear, but from memory. Her cruelty had never stemmed from power, it was born of jealousy, of a bottomless void she thought I had filled. The third fragment came from the river, where her blood had once stained the reeds. I walked barefoot into its freezing waters, chanting prayers I hadn't spoken in years. My body trembled, but I did not stop. When I emerged, the moon reflected in the ripples like Luna's eye, and the shard pulsed faintly against my chest. I was running out of time. The fourth shard was in Lucas's hands, locked in a pendant he wore unknowingly, a gift from Madeline etched with ancient sigils. It had been given to him during their courtship, meant to bind his love. But the pendant had absorbed her soul when she died, and now it poisoned him from the inside. To retrieve it, I would need him to break. And he was close. One night, I heard him screaming in his sleep. I didn't know she'd die. He stumbled out of bed, crashing into furniture, begging forgiveness from empty air. Madeline held him, but he threw her off, eyes wild. "You told me she'd be fine," he shouted. "You said she'd get up." I watched from the shadows, heart steady, eyes dry. The man who once condemned me was now begging for mercy from ghosts he couldn't see. When he passed out from exhaustion, I slipped the pendant from his neck. His body twitched once, then fell still. For shards now. I could feel Luna's spirit growing lighter, her presence warming, no longer trapped in agony. But the fifth, her core, her anchor, remained hidden. I knew where it was, and retrieving it meant returning to the one place I swore I'd never step foot in again, the inner shrine of the Shun ancestral hall, where they had cursed me, where my daughter's soul had first fractured. I was ready, and yet, part of me hesitated, not from fear, but from something more terrible. Clarity. The old Nina would have sought revenge alone, but the woman I had become now understood the price of wrath. To save Luna, I would have to face not only the ones who wronged me, but the part of myself that still longed to be seen, to be mourned, to be loved by the man who broke me. That was my final weakness, and soon I would have to cut it out. The Shun ancestral hall stood like a monument to vanity, all carved stone and hollow prayers, its crimson lanterns swaying gently in the wind as though mourning something long dead. I stepped through the threshold in silence, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that coated the marble floor. The scent of sandalwood was heavy, almost choking, as if the spirits themselves were trying to mask the rot that lay beneath. This place had once been sacred to Lukashi, had brought me here on our wedding night, beaming with pride as he explained the lineage of the Shin men who had ruled industry and power for generations. Now it stood quiet, forgotten, a shrine to a legacy soaked in betrayal. The final shard was hidden behind the altar, encased in a box of obsidian and gold, sealed by blood rites that could only be undone by one who had both borne and buried the lineage. My hands trembled as I reached for it, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing this was the last piece of Luna's soul. As my fingers touched the lock, a voice echoed behind me. "You came back," Lucas said, his tone caught between accusation and disbelief. I turned slowly, not flinching, not hiding. He looked older. Not just in body, but in spirit, his face hollow, eyes sunken, the kind of exhaustion that no sleep could cure. "You always knew I would," I replied, my voice calm, edged with something sharper than hate. He took a step forward, then faltered. "I didn't know," he whispered, almost like a confession. "I thought she said you were the danger." "She was the danger," I said, gaze locked on him. "And you chose her."
His jaw tightened.
"She said the child wasn't mine. That you tried to replace her." I laughed, bitter and soft. "And you believed her. You believed a woman you barely knew over the one who gave birth to your daughter in silence, while you celebrated someone else's lies." He looked at the altar, shame flickering behind his eyes. I didn't know what to believe. Everything felt so
loud.
I thought if I stayed with her, things would settle. "You thought silence meant peace?" I stepped closer.
"No, Lucas."
"Silence was what you gave me instead of justice." He lowered his eyes. "She's gone now," he said. "Madeline. She lost her mind. Kept seeing Luna in the mirrors, hearing her laugh in the halls. One night, she tried to dig up the garden with her bare hands. My breath caught. She saw her? I don't know," he murmured. Maybe. Maybe she saw something we refused to face." He sank to his knees then, without pride, without pretense. "I see her too. Every night. Sometimes she calls my name. Sometimes she just cries." I wanted to scream at him, to strike him, to break the man who had watched me shatter and walked away. But what came out was a whisper, laced with exhaustion. "You don't get to be the broken one." He didn't answer, only watched as I turned back to the altar and opened the box. Light burst forth, not blinding, but pure, like dawn rising behind winter clouds. The shard pulsed, vibrant and full, and I felt Luna's warmth wrap around my soul like a forgotten lullaby. The pieces were whole now. She was free. I fell to my knees, tears carving silent rivers down my face. In that moment, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt hollow, empty, as if I'd been carrying her weight so long, I didn't know who I was without it. "Nina," Lucas whispered behind me. Is she really gone?" I nodded. "Her soul will return. Somewhere new. Somewhere clean." He reached out, not to touch me, but just to feel the space between us. "What about you?" he asked. "What happens to you now?" I looked at him then, really looked for the first time since that day in the garden. He was no longer the man who had condemned me. He was the man who had to live with what he'd done. And that was worse. "I carry the ash," I said softly. "You live in the smoke." He closed his eyes. "Do you still hate me?" I stood, every muscle aching with the weight of forgiveness I refused to offer. "No," I said. "But I pity you." I left him kneeling there, in the hall of his ancestors, surrounded by their silent judgment. Outside, the wind had changed. The trees whispered a softer tune. I felt Luna drift from me like mist, not in pain, not in fear, but in peace. And yet, something in my chest still ached. A thread remained uncut. Days passed. Lucas tried to find me again, leaving offerings at temples, scribbling apologies in the margins of forgotten letters. He returned to the mountain shrine where he had once exiled me, kneeling in snow until his knees bled. But karma does not barter. It balances. I saw him once more, From the edge of a temple ridge, as he wandered the path below, a lone figure bowed by grief. He carried a relic Naomi old prayer beads, worn down to dull bone. He chanted the sutras I used to whisper, not as a ritual, but as a plea. He was no longer asking for redemption. He was asking to forget. And that, I realized, was the final punishment. Not remembering what you've done, but remembering who you were supposed to protect and knowing you failed. I did not approach him. I let him walk alone into the mist, swallowed by the silence he had created. I turned toward the north, where the wind was warmer, where children's laughter echoed faintly through the trees, where perhaps, in another lifetime, I might meet her again under a different sky, with a different name, where neither of us would remember this pain. But for now, I walked on, not to flee, but to begin again, not as a ghost, not as vengeance, but as the mother who had finally learned to let go. Grief, when left too long without release, begins to ferment into madness. That truth revealed itself in Lucas not through dramatic collapse, but in the quiet erosion of his mind, piece by piece, like stone worn down by wind. The city no longer recognized the name Shen with reverency. It was whispered now with unease, associated with closed doors, missed calls, silent boardrooms. His signature on contracts had once sealed fates. Now it raised questions. Where others saw a powerful man unraveling, I saw something far more wretched, a man beginning to understand the weight of a soul he had once cast away. He stopped shaving. He refused to eat unless it came from a temple kitchen. I heard from an old caretaker that he spoke to empty chairs at night, that he no longer allowed mirrors in his home. Sometimes, they said, he stood in the garden for hours, barefoot in the frost, whispering her name Luna-like, a spell he hoped would summon her back. Madeline, whose ambition once burned like wildfire, had become unrecognizable. She lived in a locked room, covered every reflective surface, and refused to wear red, convinced it would summon spirits. Her beauty faded fast, not from time, but from the haunting that pressed against her every breath. She painted over her face each morning in thick foundation, but the fear showed through in the way her eyes darted at shadows, in the way she screamed at the sound of wind. One evening, she wandered into the town's old chapel in her nightdress, barefoot and trembling, clutching a child's stuffed toy she swore was calling her. The priest, horrified, said she spoke in a child's voice, asking for her mother. After that, she was institutionalized. Lucas didn't visit.
Couldn't.
Perhaps wouldn't. He had begun to fear touch, human warmth, anything that reminded him he was still alive, while the one he should have saved had long turned to ash. He became obsessed with relics, charms, bones, ashes, any trace of me he could find. He bribed monks to perform soul-calling rituals, not realizing they were too late. He dug up old photographs and stared at them for hours, as if he could find hidden messages in the cracks between smiles. One night, he broke into the ruins of the old shrine where I had once prayed and collapsed in the center, arms outstretched, eyes wild. "Take it all back," he begged the sky. "Please." I was wrong. But the sky did not answer. I watched from afar, veiled in fog, not out of cruelty, but because the sight of him broken, crawling, no longer proud did not bring me joy. Only silence. There was no triumph left in me, only distance. One stormy night, Lucas did something that startled even me. He went to Madeline's hospital room and, without warning, took a blade to her face. Not to kill her, but to erase the beauty he once chased. "She smiled like you," he muttered to the police as they arrested him. "That's why I followed her. But she never had your eyes." He spent 2 months in prison before he was quietly moved to a psychiatric ward. His family disowned him publicly, erasing his name from the lineage. He no longer existed in the eyes of society. But that wasn't the end. His descent deepened. He began drawing symbols on the walls, ancient mantras warped by obsession. He whispered my name in every therapy session, sometimes lovingly, sometimes screaming it like a curse. One nurse reported that he began clawing at his chest during full moons, convinced he could dig out the pendant he no longer wore. He spoke of me like a goddess and a ghost, protector and executioner. "She was light," he told one orderly, "and I burned her." On the edge of his madness, he began writing letters, hundreds, thousands, never sent, each one addressed to Nina, filled with fragments of memory, apology, and delirium. He wrote about the sound of Luna's laughter, about my favorite tea, about a prayer he once overheard me say. In one, he wrote, "You carried us. I only learned to crawl when you were gone." In another, "If there's a next life, don't look for me. I don't deserve it." These letters were never delivered, but I read them all. I found them in an old chest the hospital had confiscated, kept by a kind nurse who said, "He wrote like a man drowning with no water." I burned them not in anger, but to release their weight from this world. I did not cry. Not for him. But I did whisper one final chant for the part of him that once could have loved truly, before power and pride turned him into something else. They say karma is a wheel, but it's more like a mirror. Sooner or later, you are made to face yourself. Lucas did. And in the reflection, he saw not a monster, but a man who had everything, and in his fear of losing it, destroyed the only thing that made him worthy. I left a prayer bead on his window sill one night, just one. He never touched it, only stared at it unmoving for hours. Eventually, he stopped speaking.
Stopped eating.
Nurses said he just watched the mountains now, as if waiting for someone to descend from them and end it all. But there was no savior coming. I had already left the mountain. I had already said goodbye. He was alone, exactly as he had chosen. Exactly as I had warned. I thought I had finished with the world when I burned the last of Lucas's letters and turned away from the ashes of our past, but the divine ones had other plans for me. On the third night of the lotus moon, as I sat beneath the Bodhi tree in the northern temple, my breath steady, my pulse as still as the mountain air, the enlightened one appeared not in form, but in presence, like warmth settling on my shoulders, like an ancient silence pressing against my thoughts. The wind stopped. The leaves held still. And in that hush, I heard a voice not with my ears, but with my soul. "You are not yet finished." I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The burden I had carried, the rage I had endured, the sorrow I had woven into the very fabric of my being, they had hollowed me out, but in that hollow, I had carved space for something else. Purpose. "Luna's soul has passed," the voice continued, "but she is not yet free. Her essence lingers in the veil between lifetimes. You must guide her through." I closed my eyes, and for the first time in what felt like centuries, I wept not out of grief, but release. I was not only her mother. I was now her vessel, her bridge, her lantern in the dark. The ritual was not one of fire or blood, but of memory. I returned to the places where she had once laughed, once held my finger in her tiny grip, once cried into my chest. With each location, I offered not vengeance, but light. A toy buried under a tree, retrieved and placed on a monk's altar. A ribbon from her hair, tied to the rail of a bridge she once waved from. A half-finished lullaby I used to hum, now sung fully into the wind. And with each offering, I felt her spirit soften, untether, inch closer to peace. The final rite required me to let go of the last thing I had held tightly, my name. Nina Grace had carried pain, had wielded fire, had walked through agony barefoot and unblinking. But that name was born in sorrow. To release Luna, I had to shed it. In the sacred pool behind the temple, I stood ankle-deep in still water under the rising sun. My reflection shimmered, not broken, but unfamiliar. I took one breath and spoke. "I release you, and I release myself. From name, from pain, from the weight of remembering." And then I stepped forward, submerging myself until silence took everything. When I rose, dripping and trembling, the monks said nothing, but I could feel in their stillness that they understood. I was no longer a woman haunted by her past. I was now the guide for those who linger between. The enlightened one did not visit again. It didn't need to. Its presence remained in every fluttering prayer flag, in the warmth of tea shared with pilgrims, in the gentle weight of a child's hand pressed to mine as they asked questions about the stars. Word spread quickly through the highlands and villages that a woman in white could calm crying infants, that the ill dreamed of peace after she chanted at their bedside, that even dying men smiled when she touched their forehead. They came not for miracles, but for closure. I gave them what I could, never more, never less. But I never spoke of Lucas. Never spoke of Madeline. Their story had been written, their fates sealed by their own choices. Still, karma has a long echo. I learned one evening from a traveler that Lucas had been moved again, this time to a temple in the south, not as a patient, but as a servant. He cleaned the floors. He lit the incense. He recited prayers in silence. They said he never asked for forgiveness, but that he no longer feared silence. That he looked out over the courtyard every morning at dawn, as if waiting for something, but never expecting it. I wondered, briefly, if he recognized the peace in those prayers, the same ones I had once whispered when we were young and stupid and thought love could survive pride. And then I let the thought go. I did not belong in his story anymore. My place was with those still learning to let go. Then one morning I saw her, not in flesh, not in dream, but in the eyes of a newborn girl cradled in a mother's arms outside the temple gate. The infant stared at me with a serenity no infant should have, and when I reached out, she wrapped her fingers around mine and cooed, just once, as if saying, "I'm here." I smiled, though my heart clenched like a bell struck too hard. She had returned. Not to me, not to the past, but to the world, in light, in new form, untouched by the darkness she had once suffered. That was all I had ever asked for. I did not tell the mother who I was. I simply blessed the child, pressed a lotus charm into her tiny palm, and walked away. And as I walked, the world seemed brighter, not because it had changed, but because I had. I no longer burned with fury. I no longer needed to be remembered. I was not a name. I was not a tragedy. I was the silence after grief, the breath after crying, the sun after storm. And that was enough. I didn't intend to return, but the wheel of karma has a way of calling you back to the places you thought you'd buried in memory. It was late autumn when I passed through the southern foothills again, the air brittle with cold and the scent of pine thick in every breath. The monks told me he had stopped eating entirely, that he no longer spoke, no longer slept through the night, that sometimes he wandered the stone corridors barefoot, murmuring chants in a voice so soft it barely touched the air. They said he never asked for visitors, never expected them. And yet, when I stepped into the shadowed hall where he sat hunched beside the lotus brazier, he raised his head slowly, as if some invisible thread had tugged at his bones. "So," Lucas whispered, his voice as cracked as dried earth. "You came." I didn't respond right away. I simply stood there, watching the man who once stood so tall now curled into himself like a forgotten page in a ruined book. The last time I had seen him, he was still trying to fix things by force, still clinging to power like it meant something. Now he looked empty, not in the way the dead do, but in the way the living sometimes become hollowed out by the long silence after the screaming ends. "I didn't come for you," I said, though the lie sat heavy in my chest. "I came to close the thread." He nodded once, slowly, and I noticed his hands were trembling not from fear, but age, or perhaps the weight of time dragging him downward inch by inch. "I was going to die in silence," he said. "I thought that was my punishment." "You're not dying," I replied. "You're remembering. That's worse." A flicker of something passed over his eyes. Regret. Yes, but more than that. Recognition. The way a blind man might recognize the sun by the warmth it leaves behind on his skin. "Do you hate me still?" he asked. "I don't feel anything anymore," I said quietly. "Not hate. Not anger. Not pity. You're no longer part of my story." He looked down then, to the floor between us, as though the answer had already been carved into the stone long ago. "She came to me," he said after a long pause. "In a dream. Not as a ghost. Not to haunt me."
She didn't speak.
She just looked at me. And I broke. A tear slipped from his eye, trailing slowly down the weathered crease of his cheek. I think that was the first time I understood what I'd done, not the actions, but the absence. The empty spaces I left. The things I didn't say. I crouched down beside him, the silence between us soft now, like snowfall rather than stone. "Redemption is not yours to name," I said. "You can pray until your breath fades and the mountains forget your voice. It won't change what happened. But if you carry it honestly, if you look at it each day and choose not to run, then maybe your soul will remember humility in the next life." He nodded slowly, not seeking forgiveness, but simply hearing it for what it was, a sentence spoken with finality. I rose without another word and turned toward the courtyard, where the wind stirred fallen leaves into delicate spirals, like the world itself was exhaling. Behind me, I heard the faintest whisper, "Thank you," but I didn't stop. That chapter had closed long before he spoke it. I walked until the temple was far behind me, until the path was empty, until only the rustling trees and my own breath reminded me I was still tethered to this body. And as the sun dipped low, a flicker of light passed through the forest, soft and golden and fleeting. I turned just in time to see a child skipping down a slope, her laughter echoing like the ring of a prayer bell in clear air. She looked back once, smiled, then vanished around a bend, her figure swallowed by the curve of earth and time. I did not follow. I didn't need to. Some things are meant to be witnessed, not chased. I walked on, each step lighter, no longer walking away from a past, but forward into a quiet unknown. I was not Nina Grace anymore. I was not wife, nor widow, nor martyr. I was a ripple returning to the ocean. A breath between lifetimes. A name the wind no longer needed to remember. And somewhere beyond the mountains, beneath another sky, a soul I once loved danced freely in the light.